Hello there, it's Jo from Minerva. Today we're going to do a sew along of the Marnie blouse. If you've not seen the Marnie blouse yet, it is an absolute stunner. I've been really looking forward to making it. It is a blouse that has lots of different details so it can really grow with your sewing skill. The fabric suggestions for this pattern are a cotton, a voile, a lawn to get that sort of matte cotton finish. There's also the chance to use a rayon or something with a tencel or a drape quality when you make the dress version. You can make this as a top or a dress, and you can add as many different features as you want. There are sleeve ruffles, a neck collar ruffle. There are pin tucks along the front bodice, pin tucks on the sleeves as well, and it's got a two-style tone sleeve, which is a tighter fitting top with a balloon or bishop sleeve at the bottom. The cuffs are finished with elastic, so you can change that to your size as well. No tricky cuffs or button fastenings. The top goes on over your head and it has a little button at the back, so there are no zips either. Let's have a look at what I'm using today. I'm using an embroidered anglaise, which is a white cotton. I think this one's a poly cotton, and it's got embroidery detail on with the little holes. It's got quite a wide selvage, so you want to make sure that you bring the selvages together and you're using the pattern part of the fabric. Cut this fabric so that you place your pattern pieces on the reverse, so any markings that you make aren't on the right side of the fabric. It's really easy to cut accurately. If you want to have a little play with pattern matching, you can really have a go at pattern matching with the vertical print, but if not, it really doesn't matter because you will get that sort of overall matte finish of white. I think this will make a really good Marnie blouse because it will have that sort of really traditional feel, and I'm going to add the neck ruffle, the pin tucks on the sleeve, the pin tucks on the front. I'm not going to add the sleeve ruffle. I've done videos on how to do a sleeve ruffle before, and it's the same gathering technique as other parts of the pattern. I'm going to follow the pattern as if you were at home, so we'll be following through the instructions in the right order. Just sometimes if you can see it in action, it really puts the pattern into perspective. There is quite a bit of stitching detail on this pattern, so I recommend that you buy 2 rolls of thread, and the buttons that are in the products listed below is a really lovely match. It's a little pearly button that really suits that fabric. All the other tools and things that I use in today's video will be listed below. First of all, we need to cut the fabric, so I've got one of my speedy music along cutout sections coming up. A few things to note in there: if you're using the fabric that I'm using today, it's quite a narrow width of fabric, and the sleeve piece here is pretty wide and it won't fit on the width of the fabric when it's folded in half. So I've had to fold my pattern piece in half and reduce the width of the sleeve by half and use the fold, and then cut 2 on the fold, which you'll see in the picture. Also, you've got to mark those pin tucks, so you can use the clips on the side to notch across, or if you think you'll need a little bit more guidance because you want to be really accurate with those pin tucks and you've not used them before, then you might like to mark the full length of the line. Just be careful because you don't want a mark on your fabric, so make sure that you use something on the reverse, a pale colour, or a marking tool that will wash out or fade when you wash your garment. Let's see how to cut out the Marnie blouse. There are quite a few sections to today's sew along, but as ever, Tilly and the Buttons patterns break it down into really nice easy chunks for you. So the first part of the pattern is to stay stitch the neck line of the front piece and the back piece. Stay stitching is a line of stitching that goes just through one layer of fabric. You can see it's just pulled my fabric in a little bit, and it's stopping the fabric that's cut on the cross grain from splaying open, because if this starts to splay open and become a bigger circumference, then other pieces might not fit, like the neck binding and the collar. Now it's time to add that detail, the pin tucks on the front. I'm going to show you how to do the pin tucks really carefully in this bit, and then we know that we can replicate that when we're doing the same technique on the sleeves. This is the bit you want to spend the most time on, so you'll be looking for these pin tuck marks that you've got down the side. And I like to start on the bottom one because I can use the bottom line of the yoke to check how parallel my pin tuck is. You can also use a seam gauge to keep checking along that your pin tuck isn't ballooning out at different parts. So we're going to put the two notches together, and it is really tiny. You think, oh, that's not much of a pin tuck, but you're going to put 4 of these pin tucks in, and you want to make sure that your pin tuck is going to appear on the right side of your fabric. So I'm going to bring the notches together. So there's 2 notches there quite close together, and when I fold the fabric in half and bring those 2 together, I'm going to pin a little bit away from the pin tuck. If you try and pin the pin tucks like you pin a seam, the pins just get in the way. So pin your pin tucks a little bit away from where you're trying to sew. Then you can get your foot in there, you can get your iron in there, you can get close to the tuck to do the detail to it. You want to make sure that it's parallel to the bottom, that it's not ballooning out, because if it's allowed to sort of billow out and sag in the middle, then you won't get a straight pin tuck. Let's start sewing the first one. I like to sew one, press it, move to the next one. If you try and pin them all, everything gets in the way. Accuracy is everything when you're making these pin tucks, so you might need to be double checking here that you're getting the same pin tuck line across. I've tried a first test piece with my machine foot, running my machine foot up against the edge, but actually that is making a 7mm tuck. So that then I'm 2 centimeters out, 2mm out on this side, I'm 2mm out on that side. So that means each pin tuck is 4mm bigger than it should be. So then when I come to use this piece and attach it to the next piece, this piece of fabric isn't going to be the right length. So it's not just about making neat pin tucks. You can't just make them a bit bigger and think, oh, well, that looks a bit nicer, because you're actually changing the dimensions of your fabric piece. I've tried a little bit of sticky tape on my foot plate to give me a bit of a guideline, and I also had a little rummage through my machine feet, and this is my narrow hem foot, rolled hem foot, and when I put it in, although I'm not using the rolled hem feature on it, it actually gave me a really nice accurate 5mm line when I ran the foot up against the edge. And I had a little test, and when I measured, I got the big one that I did that I believe to be wrong, and when I measured, then this one was a really accurate 5mm. So you need to find a way of making sure that you get that 5mm, either drawing it on if you've got a busy fabric, trying a different foot, putting some tape on the foot plate, using a magnet seam guide, anything that makes it as accurate as possible. Once you've made your first pin tuck, you can go and press that, and that keeps that one out of the way, and then you can move on to the next one. So don't forget, you've got a 1cm pin tuck. When you fold it in half, you've only got 5mm to sew. Find the next one, make sure there's a parallel amount of distance between your next pin tuck and the one from before. Keep going until you've got 4 pin tucks. To make the pin tucks undulating, you'll need to find the center point of your front yoke. So fold it in half and snip. And from this center line, you're going to measure 4 centimeters out, and one of your tucks will have a vertical line 4 centimeters out and another set of tucks. So you'll be having, and you need to make sure they go in alternate directions. I'm using an air erasable pen here because I don't want to mark my fabric, but you do have to sew this from the right side, so you can't mark these from the wrong side. So I'm just going to use the smallest of marks. Your centre ones will remain pointing down. Use a nice long pin that holds all of those tucks down, and then your next line is going to go up. You can use an iron to press those up, down, up, down, up, down, up, and then you're going to put a vertical line of stitching straight through all of the pin tucks. Make them really neat at the ends and do a little back tack so that you can just snip the thread straight off. There'll be no knots. And there we are. Isn't it gorgeous? You can just give it a final press, pressing them up and down and up and down. I recommend. We're going to prepare the back edge pieces, so you'll need to be edge stitching the back of your yoke pieces and adding your button loop. I've edge stitched the back yokes and applied the little loop, which is all simple straight sewn that you can see from the instructions. So you've got your front and back yokes complete. It's time to assemble the main yoke and body pieces. So you're going to put together the front and the back yoke and the side panels fabric. And you need to take a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance here. Again, you need to be aware of your seam allowance stitch line because you've got pieces that are going to join to this along here, so you don't want to make these ends too long or too short. So that's the first stage of putting the body together. Those seams are all pressed open, and now we're going to do the same with the side body panels. So I'm just going to be aware that my fabric has a very similar right side and wrong side, so I don't want to get those mixed up. And these pieces look quite similar, so I'm going to put pins in the back so that I know that those are the back pieces. I'm going to pin the side panels together at the shoulder seams also. I'm going to repeat here what I did on the yokes. We're going to make the ruffle collar. It's a really simple sewing process, but it makes a really effective collar. Effective to do. So you fold the collar in half along the long edge, make sure you've got right sides together, and then you just sew along the ends, not the long raw edge, just the short raw edge, and you make sure you've got lovely points on the back that will be seen on the back of your blouse. And then on this raw edge here, which are the 2 long edges joining, you're going to put 2 rows of gathering stitches, and you're really looking for your 2 rows of gathering stitches to have enough space in between to attach it to your top. And that space in between is the real sweet spot of getting the gathers in the seam line. So you take a row of gather 5mm from the edge, then you take a row of gather a little bit further from the edge, and then if you sew in the middle of that line, when you pull the gathering stitches out, you'll have really maximised the gathering of those stitches. Okay, we're going to draw up threads. If you use the bobbin threads, have a little bit more give in them. It is tricky with embroideries anglaise because you've got the sort of little places where the thread will catch a little bit on the embroidery, but just take it steady, use your thumb, and you want this ruffle to fit around the neckline of your top. And you can see there where I like to attach the top is in between the two gathering stitches, because in there, that is where the gathering is the most even. If I sew past the last line of gathering, then I do risk the chance of getting little folds in it. But really that track, it's like a railway track, and in the middle of that railway track is where the gather is the most even. Okay, I feel well prepared for this part now. So I've got my yoke backs, I've got my ruffle collar attached, got my 2 rows of gather, and I'm going to now stitch 1.5, and that happens to land right inside that ring of gathering stitches. Remember to put your machine back to a stitch that will hold your collar on securely, and then you can pull out your gathering threads. The neckline is finished with a piece of binding. I haven't used binding in embroideries anglaise because sometimes embroideries anglaise, where you have the little embroidery pieces, you get a little lump and you don't always get such a smooth stitch line over that. So if I want it to be really nice and smooth on the inside, not have a little bit of a lump in the embroidered fabric. So I've cut my strip of bias binding out of some plain cotton, but you could also use ready-made bias binding. You can press your neck binding in half and then in half again, or you can use a bias binding maker. So there's a few other little bits to prepare for the collar. So you've got your binding piece ready, but you'll need to trim out some of this collar, especially if you've put the ruffle collar on. And I'm going to trim the gathered side because that's the bulkier of the seam allowance. I'm going to keep the flat edge of the yoke because that's a good guide for my seam line. And now I'm going to lay my bias binding right sides together, lining up all of the raw edges. So I'll have a little bit sticking out at the end just for handling and finishing the end. And I'm going to use that fold line I made with the iron to sew this binding onto the neck. I'm going to use my original stitch line as a good guide, and if I need to take out any more of that yoke I can, if it makes a really nice flat collar area. Okay, to finish off, from the wrong side, we're going to pull the binding down over the top raw edge. If it's a bit bulky, take a little bit more out if you need to, that's not a problem. You probably pull this over. And you've got 2 choices here, depending on your skill level, you can put this under the machine now and top stitch. So you'll be top stitched from the inside, and from the outside you'll have another line of stitching, and that's where you've got to be careful, because look, if I top stitch that, I would have a couple of kinks there. So you need to really make sure that when you fold the binding over, you're keeping the yoke underneath flat. So that probably needs a little bit more time and care than I'm currently giving it. So that's what the collar looks like from the inside, with all the raw edges bound down. And you can finish it off with your button, and you should have your ruffle collar making a smooth line across the back. We're moving on to some gathering, so we're going to start gathering the front piece that goes onto the yoke, and also looking at how the back piece fits on. I'm going to show you the gathering technique now, and it will be the same technique as you use for the sleeve. When I've got it gathered up, I'm then going to put my yoke on top. I'm a little bit long, so I'm just going to pull my threads a little bit more, but I don't want all the gathering in one place. Pin vertically so that you can sew from the gathering side, because then you can check that your gathers are even. Stitch along here at 1.5 seam allowance. Going to do the same with the back panel, so the back panels need to be flush next to each other with right sides together. Put the panel on the back. I'm going to mark the center point so that I can work the gathers from the center out. Then I know I've got the center point right where those two back panel pieces meet. I'm going to put a pin in each of those to stop them moving around, and repeat the process. Right, we're going to find those long side panels now that have got the stitch shoulder. Remember, I put a pin in so I knew which was the back, so this end is the back. And the curved edge of that unit touches the top so that the shoulder seams are aligned. And now we can find all of the notches and attach the side panels. It's a good idea once you get to this stage that you give everything a really good press, because once you've got the sleeves on, you've got more weight of fabric and you can't quite get into all the places. So make sure you've pressed these seams here because they create the bust shaping. Make sure that you've got your seam line here pointing downwards, and you've pressed all around the collar. Once you've got your body together with the gathered pieces on the bottom, now is the time to put on the sleeve ruffles. If that's what you're doing, you need to make sure that they're on before you apply your sleeves. We've got lots of repeat skills coming up now in the pattern, so you'll be making the undulating tucks along the edge of the sleeve like you did across the front of your top. Add a line of easing stitches to the top of the sleeve. That will help it to curve and fit into the sleeve opening really accurately, and you're going to use that same gathering technique we used on the yoke to gather the bicep part of the sleeves. So gather along the lower sleeve and attach it to your upper sleeve, and your undulating tuck should be just above the gathers, and you need to add an easing stitch around the head of your sleeve, and you can see just before we sew up the side seams. There's a little trick that I like to use, a little sewing technique. I've got to turn up this for a casing towards the end of the pattern, but once it's in a circle like this, if that was already sewn, then I'm trying to measure and pin and measure in a circle, and that's tricky to be accurate. It's much easier to be accurate when an item is flat. So I'm going to fold the hem up 1 centimetre and give it a press, but I'm not going to sew it yet. I'm just going to give myself a really easy press line that I'll refer to and come back to later when I make the casing. This is sort of thinking ahead move, this. And then I'm going to turn it up another 1.5 centimetres and give it a press. I'm going to keep that line from before. So I'm marking out my casing now so that I can mark it out flat rather than trying to mark it out in a circle. My first press is 10 millimetres, my second press is 15 millimetres. I'm using the hot hammer because I can get an accurate measure and press at the same time. Let's get that body piece ready to put the sleeves in. So you're going to sew up the side seams. I know that I've probably said before that I like to put sleeves in flat, but because this has a cut point here and some sleeve features, we're making the sleeve as a whole tube because of all the features in it, so we need to insert it as a tube. Sew up the underarm seam of the sleeves, and then you can turn it ready to fit into the armhole. I'm not going to show you how to do that today. I think you know to match the notches up and to put the underarm seam with the underarm seam. Just make sure that you use lots and lots and lots of pins, especially around the sleeve head. If you put pins in vertically, you'll be able to accommodate and ease in more fabric. If you put your pins in straight, you tend to get sort of ripples, and then you'll get puckers along your sleeve head. And now I'm going to sew up the side seam of the sleeve, the underside. I'm going to open out that press and pin it, ease all of the sleeve in and sew up the under sleeve, and then all my pressing and marking is already done for the casing. I've got the sleeves right side out. I've got the top inside out. I'm going to put the sleeve into the sleeve hole, match up the underarm seam, and match up the notches. Now it's time to put the casings on, but of course we've already done it because we've got the press line ready, so we can just fold it all down and just refold there on the join. And the casing's done. I love doing that. The elastic is 9mm wide, so make sure when you sew your casing that you don't use up too much of the casing space. So measure your casing and see how much you've got left. You need quite a narrow seam on there. Try your garment on, check it for length. You've got 2 centimeters hem allowance on here, so you fold up by 1 centimeter, fold up again and press, and then you can edge stitch around the bottom. If you've got a fabric that you think would benefit from having a hand stitch, then that's fine too. Okay, I recommend before hemming that you try it on, because if you've got a large bust, then this hem will lift up because you'll be taking some of the volume from the top of the blouse, and you don't want the hem to be too short. So you may need to hem the front and back with a slight gradient. You might want to have the back a bit longer than the front. You need to check what sort of shaping you want in your final garment. It's time to put it on. I'm so excited. It's time to wear my Marnie blouse. Here it is on. You need to make sure all of your seams are pressed throughout as you go. Otherwise, because you've got lots of details like the ruffles and the tucks and everything and gathers, you don't want to spoil the look of those features by having a sort of bubbly seam. So make sure you press all of your seams. There is a little gather on the sleeve head. It's a bit more than an easing stitch. And this is made in an embroidered anglaise. The top has quite a swing hem. I'm quite short in the body and quite a petite frame, so it's better for me if I tuck mine into my jeans. But of course you can make it longer to make the dress version. If you've made Marnie, we would love to see it, so make sure you have an account with us at Minerva. It's free to join the sewing community, and you can join in with events, inspiration and projects from lots of makers from all over the world, and you can also take a look at the products that we sell. Minerva also has a craft club which you can join, and that will give you further discounts throughout the year. I hope you've enjoyed today's sew along. Do come back again for more sew alongs. There are sewing tutorials as well on specific skills, and you can check all of those out here at Minerva. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.